Hello to you, and welcome back for another biblical adventure today in 1 Samuel chapter 16. A really important chapter. We're introduced to a really important Bible character. But first, let's talk about when these events took place. And by the way, you can download this PDF on our website for free. Israel's first king, whose name was Saul, we've been talking about him, he became king probably around 1050 BC. The events of this chapter took place several years after that, probably around 1025 BC. Now let's talk about the important characters of chapter 16. First of all, we've got Samuel. He was God's prophet, and he was the last significant judge of Israel before the kings took over. We're going to talk about a new guy named Jesse. Jesse was from the town of Bethlehem, and he had 8 sons. His youngest son was named David. Yes, we're going to be introduced to David, he's very important in the Old Testament history and in the history of the New Testament and the story of the Bible. David was selected by God to be the second king of Israel. And then we obviously have Saul, who was the first king of Israel. But remember, in the last chapter, God rejected him as king and told him that the kingdom was going to go to somebody else. The map is pretty easy for today. As I mentioned, Jesse and David lived in Bethlehem. So that's where we're going to spend the first part of the chapter. Maybe you've heard of the city of Bethlehem being referred to as the city of David. And now you know why. All right, so we're in the business of selecting a new king as we open up chapter 16. Verses 1 through 13 are all about David being anointed as the next king of Israel. So in chapter 15, Saul had that issue where he didn't obey God in the matter of the Amalekites, and so God rejected him as king. Samuel's really sad about this. He's grieving about this, but God tells him to get up. And in chapter 16, he told him to go to Bethlehem, and there in Bethlehem, he would find the next king of Israel, and he was supposed to go anoint him. So Samuel took a sacrifice. He went to Bethlehem, and he invited a guy named Jesse and his sons to accompany him to the sacrifice. And Samuel looked out over Jesse's sons, and Samuel assumed that one named Eliab would be God's selection, presumably because he looked like a king, maybe even looked like King Saul, who was really tall and really handsome. But God told Samuel that his selection was going to be based on the heart, not on the outward appearance. Jesse put forward 7 of his sons to be potential king candidates, but the Lord ended up rejecting them all. Jesse did have one final son, the youngest, but he was off shepherding the sheep. Samuel asked Jesse to call his youngest son, whose name was David, and as soon as he arrived, God said, "This is the man who I want to be the next king of Israel." David was described as ruddy, handsome, and having beautiful eyes. So Samuel, at God's instruction, took his horn of oil and he anointed David to be the next king of Israel. And we're told that the Spirit of God, quote, rushed upon David from that day forward, just as the Spirit had blessed Saul when he was anointed to be king. Now that God has selected his new king, we are going to see what happens to Saul, and it's not a good thing. So in verses 14 through 23, Saul's harmful spirit and David's lyre. A lyre is an instrument, not that David was a liar. Spelled Lyre. I believe it's a stringed instrument. So God's spirit left Saul, and in its place, God sent a harmful spirit which tormented him. Now Saul's servants saw that their king was suffering, and they encouraged him to go find a musician who could play music every time that the harmful spirit afflicted him and get relief that way. One of Saul's servants knew about a very young, talented Bethlehemite who was very good at playing the lyre, and that just so happened to be David. Coincidence? Probably not. Probably the providence of God. So Saul sent to Jesse. He asked for his son David to come and to serve him in this musical way, and David came. And whenever the harmful spirit afflicted Saul, David would play the lyre and Saul would get relief. So it's interesting, we're seeing this replacement of the king playing out, but it is going to be somewhat of a slow process. It wasn't immediate. And so that is 1 Samuel chapter 16. That's our introduction to David. Don't worry, we'll be talking about him a lot more in the future. Let's do our application for today. David may not have looked like a king in the same way that Saul looked like a king, but he had the heart of a king, and that's what God cared about. The application for us is, since we don't have the ability to see the quality, the virtue of a person's heart, we should reserve passing judgment on them too quickly until we know their character. Since we don't have the ability to see the quality of a person's heart, we should reserve our judgment about their openness to the gospel. For example, sometimes you look at somebody and you're like, he wouldn't be interested in hearing about Jesus. Right? But we don't know that. The outward appearance can be deceiving. And several times in my life, I've been proven wrong about my assumptions. Right? So we don't want to hold the gospel back from anybody. We don't want to withhold sharing the good news of Jesus. Since we don't have the ability to see the quality of a person's heart, we should reserve our judgment about the value of a person in the kingdom of God. Maybe we look at somebody and they don't have kind of the characteristic marks of someone who we in this world would consider to be successful. And we say, well, they're not going to be super valuable here in the church or to the kingdom. That's not necessarily true. The marks of earthly success they're not necessarily a statement about the virtue of an individual's character and how productive or how valuable or how faithfully they are going to serve God in his kingdom. This is a lesson we learn from really the entire Bible, including from Jesus himself, who didn't necessarily look like a king. Judging somebody by looking at their exterior just really isn't that accurate of a way to assess somebody. And since we have such a limited knowledge about who they actually are and what's underneath the surface, we should refrain from judging in an ungodly way.